Creatures of the Night, A Gothic Romance, by John Zerga Jr., Creatures of the Night, A Gothic Romance, Part 1, East Houston Street, Chapter 1. The street throbbed beneath his boots, a living pulse echoing through the veins of the city. Darrell Varkov, Scion of Queens, felt it, a rhythm buried deep within the asphalt, entwined with a history, the accumulated weight of 8,000,000 souls pressing against the ancient stone of the island. It was midnight, or near enough that the distinction had faded into obscurity. The pavement of East Houston Street unfurled before him like a cracked spider's web, slick with spilled ale and a drizzle that tasted of soot and forgotten promises. He walked eastward, drawn toward an elusive destination he could not name, New York City, the eve of All Hallows, October 31st, 1992. The skyline loomed in the distance like a wounded colossus, the Chrysler Building's Art Deco crown shimmering faintly through the fog, the Empire State Spire piercing the smog-choked clouds as if gesturing toward realms humanity was never meant to witness. The light pollution conjured a perpetual twilight, a bruised purple haze that permitted neither true darkness nor genuine light. The city breathed around him, hyperventilating on the cusp of All Hallows, exhaling steam from its manholes like a beast stirring from troubled slumber. He was a man out of time, this Darrell Varkov. The map of Eastern Europe was etched in the sharp Slavic angles of his visage, in the heavy brooding set of his brow, in the way his shoulders moved beneath his black shirt like machinery forged for labor rather than grace. Educated in the brutalist concrete halls of Queens College, in the hushed, dusty stacks of the CUNY Graduate Center, he bore the weight of that education like stones in his pockets, Aristotle and Aquinas, the terrifying unanswered questions of the sublime. At 25 years, his eyes held the weariness of a man who had gazed too long into philosophical abysses, finding them tedious compared to the emptiness that resided within his own chest. He donned black not as mere fashion, but as a shroud. His long wool coat, unearthed from a thrift store in Astoria, bore the scent of mothballs and ancient incense, dragging slightly in the wind like the wings of a grounded crow. He walked with the heavy, grounded gait of his father and his father's father before him, men who had labored with their hands, who had known the weight of existence, who had never drifted through the world like the phantoms that surrounded him now. The air thrummed with chaos, horns wailed in the distance like gutted beasts, punks slurred curses outside a bodega, their leather jackets adorned with safety pins, their mohawks wilting in the drizzle like dying exotic flowers. Sirens keened through the subterranean growl of the subway, that rumbling that shook the earth like a leviathan stirring beneath the streets. Steam slithered from the manholes, coiling upward like specters, seeking escape from whatever inferno burned below. The scent was distinct, a perfume of urban decay that Darrell had learned to parse like a language, garbage fermenting in the dam, diesel fumes heavy with lead, the sweet nutty aroma of roasted chestnuts from a vendor's cart, and beneath it all, the salt-rot breath of the East River, pushing against the island's edge, like a patient lover, waiting to reclaim what had always belonged to the deep. The vendor toiled at his glowing drum without raising his gaze. His face was carved from coal and shadow, his eyes never meeting the passing throng. Darrell understood. In this city no one looked up. To look up was to acknowledge the crushing weight of the towers. To look down was to see the filth. Thus they gazed through one another, these 8,000,000 ghosts, moving toward private urgencies that pressed against the night like water against a dam. And Darrell felt the isolation, a physical ache beneath his sternum, a hollow space that no amount of Aristotelian logic could fill. He thought of Poe's wanderer, that man of the crowd, desperate to be part of the throng yet eternally separate. He contemplated the Platonic fragments, souls scattered from a greater whole, endlessly searching for their counterparts, to return to the Logos, the divine reason that ordered the cosmos. In this city of fractured glass and neon, the Logos felt distant, a radio signal drowned in static. His mind wandered to his childhood, to the cramped apartment in Astoria, where his grandmother had whispered stories of the old country. She had spoken of creatures that walked between worlds, of saints who wrestled with demons, of a faith so fierce it could burn through any darkness. He had dismissed those stories as superstition then, the remnants of a peasant culture his educated mind had outgrown. But tonight, as he walked through the fog-shrouded streets, those stories felt less like myths and more like warnings. He passed a church, St. Patrick's Old Cathedral, its Gothic spires rising defiantly against the secular skyline. The iron gates were locked, but through them he could see the flickering of votive candles, tiny flames fighting against the encompassing dark. He paused there, his hand resting on the cold metal of the gate, feeling the weight of centuries pressing down upon him. His grandmother had prayed in churches like this one, her rosary beads clicking like the bones of the faithful dead. He had not prayed in years, not since his faith had crumbled beneath the weight of philosophy and doubt. But tonight, something stirred in his chest, a longing, perhaps, or a premonition. He released the gate and continued walking. The crowds thickened as he approached the heart of the neighborhood, costumed revelers spilling from bars and clubs in their Halloween finery. He saw witches and vampires, ghosts and ghouls, the sacred and the profane mingling in the gasoline-tinged air. They laughed and shouted, their voices rising in discordant harmony, celebrating the night when the veil between worlds grew thin. Darrell felt like an observer at a carnival he could never join. He had always been apart, even in crowds, the quiet boy in the corner, the student who asked questions that made professors uncomfortable, the son who could never quite live up to his father's expectations. His father had wanted him to join the union, to work with his hands as generations of Varkovs had done. Instead, Darrell had chosen books, chosen the life of the mind, chosen a path that led inexorably to this moment. alone on a Halloween night, searching for something he could not name. And then he turned on to East Houston. And there it stood. Chapter 2. The bank. It loomed like a fortress from another century, a 19th century vault reborn as a Gothic cathedral for the dying 20th. Its architecture testified to a time when money was worshipped with a solemnity now reserved for darker, older gods. Soot-scarred stucco walls rose into the night. Iron-grated windows stared like the empty sockets of a skull. Above the entrance, crimson neon hissed the word bank in letters that pulsed like an exposed artery, bathing the sidewalk in the color of fresh blood. The building itself seemed to breathe, its walls expanding and contracting in the shifting fog. Darrell knew the history of this place. He had researched it in the weeks since he first felt its pull. It had been built in 1867, a monument to the Gilded Age's worship of wealth. It had served as a bank until the crash of 1929, when it had been shuttered and left to rot. For decades it had stood empty, a hollow monument to failed prosperity, until a group of visionaries had transformed it into something new, a temple of darkness, a sanctuary for those who found more truth in shadow than in light. The crowd gathered outside was a living tableau of the macabre. The children of the night, the disaffected youth who had rejected the pastel optimism of shopping malls for the velvet embrace of the grave. They smoked clove cigarettes, those Jaram blacks whose sweet, numbing spice cut through the diesel funk. The embers glowed like tiny rhythmic hearts in the darkness, pulsing as the smokers breathed. Darrell halted across the street, watching them. He felt like a wolf circling a campfire, drawn to the warmth yet terrified of the light that would expose him. He catalogued what he saw, for cataloging was his nature, his defense against the overwhelming. The women wore black lace corsets that cinched their waists to impossible dimensions, the boning visible through the fabric, their décolletage pale as marble in moonlight. Their lips were painted the color of bruised plums, of wine left too long in the glass, of blood pooling beneath skin. They adorned themselves with velvet chokers, bearing cameos of skulls, silver anks dangling between their breasts, rings shaped like coiled serpents devouring their own tails. They were beautiful. They were terrifying. Darrell's mouth went dry watching them. The men were peacocks of the underworld, poet shirts with billowing sleeves, mesh tops revealing pale, hairless chests, hair teased into gravity-defying architectures, or slicked. The doorman stood at the entrance, a leather-clad specter whose eyes burned like coals in a face carved from the same stone as the building itself. He was not merely a bouncer. He was the guardian of the threshold, a Charon requiring a coin of intent rather than currency. His massive arms were crossed over his chest. His gaze found Darrell across the street. For a long moment neither moved. The crowds flowed around them like water around stones, oblivious to the silent communion taking place. Darrell felt those burning eyes pierced through his carefully constructed defenses, felt them strip away the layers of philosophy and doubt until nothing remained but the raw, trembling core of his being. "You're in," the doorman rasped, his voice grinding like gravel beneath a boot heel. And Darrell stepped through the iron gate. And the world shifted. Chapter 3. The interior, the air inside the bank was not air. It was a medium, thicker than atmosphere, lighter than water, carrying weight and texture that pressed against Darrell's skin like velvet. He breathed it in. It tasted of cloves and patchouli and leather and sweat. Beneath those layers, something else, something metallic, something that registered in his hindbrain before his conscious mind could name it. Copper, iron, salt. The perfume of old blood, spilled and imperfectly cleaned, seeping from the cracks between floorboards. The architecture remained from the building's former life, massive stucco arches rising toward a ceiling lost in theatrical fog, columns thick as ancient oaks, supporting the weight of a century-old structure. Yet the bank's original purpose had been utterly subverted. Where tellers once counted money behind brass cages, bars now served drinks that glowed under black lights. Where vault doors once guarded deposits, they now stood permanently open, leading to side rooms where the truly devoted could escape the main floor's assault. Black velvet curtains hung from every surface, absorbing light, muffling sound, creating pockets of intimate darkness within the larger darkness. Cobwebs clung to corners and chandeliers, real or artificial. Darrell could not tell and did not care. Candles burned in wrought iron sconces along the walls, their flames dancing in unfelt drafts, casting shadows that seemed to move independently of any source. Fog machines pumped artificial mist across the dance floor, rolling in thick white waves that obscured the feet of the dancers. Strobes cut through it in surgical slashes of light, freeze-framing the crowd into disjointed tableau. A woman mid-spin, her velvet skirt flaring like a black flower. A man with his head thrown back, throat exposed in something between ecstasy and surrender. Two figures pressed so tightly together, they seemed to share a single silhouette. The music hit Darrell like a physical force. Bauhaus poured from speakers he could not locate. Peter Murphy's baritone, intoning the opening of Bela Lugosi's Dead, that 9-minute sprawl of dub-influenced post-punk that had become the scene's sacred text. The bats have left the bell tower. The victims have been bled. The bass vibrated in Darrell's teeth, in his sternum, in the hollow space beneath his ribs where loneliness lived. It was not merely sound, it was architecture. It built a room around him, a space defined by rhythm and dread. He moved through the crowd, a solid object in a river of smoke and lace. He felt their eyes upon him, judging, assessing, dismissing. He did not care, for he sought something else. He sought the source of the signal that had drawn him here night after night, circling but never entering, until tonight. The crowd parted and closed around him like dark water, faces flickering in the strobe light like spirits glimpsed between heartbeats. He passed a woman with tears of blood painted on her cheeks. A man with a serpent coiled around his neck, a couple locked in an embrace that seemed more combat than affection. Each was a study in deliberate alienation, each a work of living art designed to proclaim separation from the daylight world. He navigated toward the bar, feeling the need for something to anchor him, some ritual of normalcy in this cathedral of the strange. The bartender was a tall, cadaverous figure with a shaved head and eyes rimmed in kohl, moving with practiced efficiency among bottles that glowed like potions in the black light. What'll it be? The voice was surprisingly gentle, at odds with the severe appearance. Whiskey. Neat. The bartender nodded, poured with a flourish, slid the glass across the scarred wooden surface. Darrell paid and drank, feeling the burn travel down his throat and bloom in his chest. The warmth steadied him, reminded him that he was still flesh, still blood, still a creature of the mortal world. He turned to survey the room, glass in hand, playing the role of observer he had perfected over years of academic detachment. But even as he catalogued and analyzed, he felt the pull growing stronger, tugging at something deep in his chest, drawing him toward the back of the club where shadows pooled like still water, and he found the fortune teller. She sat in an alcove beneath a spiraling iron staircase, enthroned behind a small table draped in purple velvet. A single candle illuminated her workspace. She was old, improbably old, her skin hanging from her bones like wet paper from a wireframe, her fingers gnarled with arthritis, yet somehow still nimble as they moved across a tarot deck with speed that suggested practice measured not in years but in lifetimes. The alcove seemed to exist in a pocket of stillness, the pounding music reduced to a distant pulse, the fog unable to penetrate its boundaries. The fortune teller's workspace was cluttered with the tools of her trade, crystals that caught the candlelight and shattered it into rainbows, bones that might have been animal, or might have been something else, jars of herbs that released their pungent scents into the close air. You're late, she croaked without looking up. Her voice scraped like dry leaves across concrete. 30 years I've been waiting in this spot. 30 years since the last one came through that door with your eyes. Darrell approached slowly, his whiskey forgotten in his hand. The last one? The fortune teller finally raised her head. Her eyes were clouded with cataracts, yet they seemed to see him with perfect clarity, to see through him, past the flesh and bone, down to the core of whatever he was. The seekers, she said, the ones who feel the pull. They come every generation or so, drawn by something they can't name, searching for something they don't understand. Most of them run away when they learn the truth. The ones who stay, she trailed off, a grim smile twisting her withered lips. The ones who stay are never quite the same. Darrell sat across from her, his body folded into the chair without his conscious decision, as if the seat had been carved specifically for his frame. The music seemed distant here, muffled by the alcove's architecture, into something almost peaceful. I don't understand, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile atmosphere. You will. And she dealt 4 cards face down, her movements ritualistic, precise. You came here asking questions. You've been asking them your whole life. What is the nature of desire? You wrote that in your notebook last week. I know because she told me. She's been watching you. Darrell's blood ran cold in his veins. Who? The fortune teller turned the first card. The tower, a structure struck by lightning, figures falling from its heights into the void below. Disaster, she whispered. Ruin, the destruction of false structures. Most men see this card and flee, boy. They see the lightning striking stone, and they fear the fall. Why don't you flinch? Darrell gazed at the card. He thought of his life, his empty apartment, his endless circular thoughts, the structures he had built from philosophy, and reason to hide from truths he could not face. He thought of his failed relationships, the women who had accused him of being emotionally absent, of living in his head while his heart gathered dust. He thought of his dissertation, abandoned halfway through, the words refusing to come because the questions he was asking had no answers his academic framework could contain. Because the tower has to fall, he said, his voice steady. The tower is false pride. It's the edifice we construct to hide from truth. Let it burn. I'm not looking for safety, mother. I'm seeking the foundation beneath the rubble. The fortune teller paused. Her gnarled hand hovered over the next card. A smile touched her lips, devoid of warmth, but full of something like respect. A philosopher, she said. She likes the thinkers, the ones who taste like ink and anxiety. She turned the second card. The moon, a path leading between 2 towers toward a horizon, dominated by the lunar disk, dogs howling at its light. Illusion, she hissed. Madness. The wolf and the dog howling at a lie. Can you trust your eyes when they betray you? I don't trust my eyes, Darrell countered. I trust the logos, the logic that holds even illusion together. The fortune teller's clouded eyes narrowed. Bold words for a man who has never faced true darkness. The logos you speak of, the divine reason, do you think it extends to places where the sun never shines? Do you think your philosophy can hold when everything you believe is stripped away? Darrell met her gaze without flinching. I believe that truth is truth, regardless of the light in which it's seen. If the logos is real, it is real everywhere, even in the dark. The third card, the lovers, 2 figures beneath an angelic presence, their bodies intertwined in sacred union. Union, she said, but union requires dissolution. Are you solid enough to melt, philosopher? Are you willing to lose the self to find the other? Darrell thought of the loneliness that had been his constant companion, the isolation that no amount of study or achievement had been able to breach. He thought of the walls he had built around his heart, the defenses that kept him safe but kept him alone. He thought of what it might mean to let those walls crumble, to open himself to another being completely, without reservation or protection. I don't know, he admitted, but I'm willing to find out. The fourth card. Death, skeleton in armor astride a white horse, trampling the fallen beneath its hooves. Your end begins tonight, she said. Or your beginning ends. The cards do not distinguish. And the temperature dropped, not gradually, not like a draft from an open door, but instantaneously. 20 degrees in a single breath. Darrell's exhalation fogged before his face. The candle flame, which had remained steady throughout his reading, guttered once and died, plunging the alcove into shadow. The fortune-teller's hands began to shake. Her cataract-clouded eyes rose, looking past Darrell's shoulder, and widened with something beyond fear, recognition mixed with submission, terror married to awe. She comes, the old woman whispered. After all these years, she comes for you. Darrell turned. Chapter 4, Callista. The crowd had parted. No one had visibly moved, yet the dancers were simply not there anymore, as if reality itself had edited them out of the frame to make room for her. She stood in a pool of darkness that seemed to originate from her, rather than surround her, a darkness that was her element, her native atmosphere, the medium in which she had always existed. Callista. Darrell beheld her. He could not look away. She was tall, nearly his height in her platform boots, and her black hair cascaded past her waist like a river of ink, like water drawn from a well that had never known sunlight, like all the darkness in the world, gathered and given form. Her skin was pale, not the pallor of illness or fear, but the white of milk kept in cellars, of marble beneath moonlight, of something that had transcended the need for blood's flush, because it had always taken what it required. That skin stretched taut over cheekbones like ceremonial blades, like instruments designed for ritual purposes, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. She wore a black velvet corset that cinched her waist impossibly tight, the boning visible through the fabric, emphasizing the dramatic swell of her hips and the lift of her breasts, a silhouette of exaggerated femininity that spoke of centuries when such architecture was armor, was weapon, was the shape power took when it wore a woman's form. Beneath the corset, a skirt of black leather fell to mid-thigh, gleaming wetly in the strobe light, as if perpetually damp with something Darrell did not wish to name. Her legs were sheathed in torn fishnets, the deliberate rips revealing glimpses of that moonlight skin beneath, and her face, that face. Her eyes were rimmed with coal black as coal dust, black as the space between stars, and within those frames her irises held no color Darrell could name. They were voids filled with ancient light, wells that had witnessed empires crumble and stars burn out, still waiting, patient as geology, for something worth witnessing. Her lips were painted the deep burgundy of wine, 3 days old, of blood pooling in the hollow of a throat, slightly parted, revealing nothing yet promising everything. She was beautiful. She was terrible. Darrell felt his body react before his mind could intervene. A tightening in his chest, a heat flooding his veins, the instinctual response of prey recognizing predator, of the moth comprehending too late the nature of the flame. But there was something else too, a recognition that went deeper than instinct, a sense of homecoming that defied all logic. Looking at her, Darrell felt as if he had been waiting his entire life for this moment, as if every book he had read, every question he had asked, every lonely night he had spent staring at the ceiling had been preparation for this encounter. She moved toward him. Her motion was wrong. The humans around her jerked in the strobe light, freeze-framed and stuttering, their movements subject to the same laws that governed all mortal flesh. But Callista poured through the space between them like smoke through a grate, like water finding its level, like something that had learned to move before bodies existed. Each step brought her closer. Each step made Darrell's heart pound harder. Each step was an eternity and an instant, time itself uncertain how to behave in her presence. The scent of her reached him before she did, cold stone, old incense, copper, and beneath it all something older, something that made his hindbrain fire with warnings his forebrain could not decode. It was the scent of crypts long sealed. It was the perfume of centuries distilled into a single presence. It was intoxicating. She halted before his table. The fortune-teller's hands shook violently now, and the old woman's breath came in shallow gasps, her eyes fixed on the floor in an attitude of absolute submission. Callista of Byzantium looked down upon Darrell Varkov, son of queens. Her ancient eyes held 11 centuries of patience. The corner of her burgundy lips curved upward, not quite a smile, but the promise of one, the ghost of amusement haunting features that had forgotten how to be amused. "You'll taste it later," she said. Her voice was a vibration that bypassed Darrell's ears entirely, resonating in his ribs, in his spine, in the marrow of his bones. She reached down and took the death card from the table. In one slow, deliberate motion, she slid it down the front of her leather skirt, her eyes never leaving his, her fingers lingering to frame her womb. The picture transformed the symbol of mortality into an invitation of desire, obscenity, and sacred promise, fused into a single act. "Philosophers," she purred, "always asking questions you've already answered. What is the nature of desire? You wrote that in your notebook, didn't you, Darrell Varkov? How do you know my name?" His voice was rough with smoke and adrenaline and something else. Something that felt dangerously like hope. "I know the shape of your mind," she whispered. "I've been tracing it for weeks. It's a labyrinth, Darrell, dark and twisting and full of dead ends. I like labyrinths." She moved around the table, her movements fluid as mercury, until she stood beside him. Her hand rose to touch his face, her fingers trailing along his jaw like a sculptor assessing clay. Her touch was cold, shockingly cold, but it sent electricity racing through his nerves, awakening sensations he had thought long dormant. "I've watched you walk past this place a dozen times," she continued. "Each night you came a little closer. Each night I felt your hunger growing. You don't know what you're hungry for, do you? You only know that nothing in your world satisfies it. And you know," Darrell managed, his voice barely a whisper, I know hunger, she said. I have known it for 1100 years. I have learned every shape it can take, every disguise it can wear, and I know when I see it in another. She extended her hand. Her fingers were long and pale, tipped with nails painted black and filed to points. She held that hand before him like an offering, like a challenge, like the key to a door he had been searching for his entire life. Dance with me. Darrell took her hand. It was cold, shockingly cold, the temperature of marble in a winter crypt, of river water beneath ice, of something that had not known warmth for longer than his bloodline had existed. But his hand was hot, calloused from work and writing, alive with pumping blood and firing nerves. Where they touched, it seemed that steam should rise, a thermal reaction between the living and the undying. She led him to the floor, or he led her. The distinction dissolved the moment their bodies began to move. Chapter 5. The dance, the music shifted. Sisters of Mercy now, Lucretia my reflection, the driving bass line sinking with the thudding of Darrell's heart. They moved together. The contrast between their forms became a language neither had spoken before, yet both understood instinctively. Darrell was broad, his movements heavy and grounded, his hands spanning the architecture of her waist through the rigid velvet of her corset. He felt the boning beneath the fabric, the steel cage that shaped her, and he felt too the cold flesh beneath that, firm and yielding and impossibly smooth. His grip was firm but uncertain, a man touching something precious and dangerous, afraid to hold too tight, afraid to let go. Callista was lithe, her body moving against his like water against stone, like shadow against light, like everything he was not, and everything he craved. She arched into him, her breast pressed against his chest, soft above the corset's edge, cold through the thin fabric of his shirt. Her hips swayed against his, close enough that he could feel the leather of her skirt sliding against his thighs, close enough that his body responded with an urgency that embarrassed and exhilarated him in equal measure. The dance floor had become their private universe. Other dancers existed only as peripheral shadows, their movements irrelevant to the ritual unfolding between these two beings. The music wrapped around them like a cocoon, pulsing with bass that seemed to emanate from the center of the earth. She tilted her head. Her black hair fell across his arm like a curtain of silk, like a veil between the world and their private ritual. She looked up at him through those ancient eyes, and a small smile played at the corners of her mouth, genuine this time, surprised, as if she had not expected to feel what she was feeling. You're warm, she murmured against his throat. Her lips brushed the pulse point, where his life beat closest to the surface. Her breath was cold, impossibly cold, raising goose flesh down his neck and across his shoulders. So warm, I'd forgotten what warmth felt like. Darrell's hand slid lower, finding the curve where her waist met her hips, pulling her closer. He felt reckless now, drunk on her proximity, on the danger that radiated from her like heat from a flame. How long? He asked. How long since you felt it? She was silent for a long moment. They moved together through that silence, bodies speaking what words could not convey. When she finally answered, her voice was smaller than before, stripped of its ancient authority. Centuries, she said. I stopped counting after the first 500 years. Darrell felt something shift in his chest, not fear, though fear was present, but something more complicated. Pity, perhaps, recognition, the terrible understanding of what it meant to be alone, magnified across a millennium. What happened? He asked. How did you become this? Her body stiffened slightly against his, a tremor running through her that might have been pain or memory or both. That is a story for darker places than this, she said. A story that requires the proper setting. I want to hear it. She pulled back just enough to meet his eyes. Her expression was unreadable, layers of centuries obscuring whatever emotions moved beneath the surface. Why? Why would a philosopher from Queens want to hear the history of a monster? Because you're not a monster, Darrell said. The words came without thought, rising from some deeper well of knowing. You're alone. There's a difference. Something flickered in her ancient eyes, surprise perhaps, or the ghost of an emotion she had thought long dead. Her grip on him tightened almost imperceptibly. You don't know what I am, she said. You don't know what I've done. Then tell me. They continued to dance, but the nature of the movement had changed. It was less seduction now and more conversation, a negotiation between two beings circling each other across an unbridgeable divide. I was born in Constantinople, she said at last, in the year 887, by your modern reckoning. My father was a merchant, my mother a woman of the court. I was raised for marriage, for politics, for the production of heirs. I was taught to read Latin and Greek, to play the lyre, to be beautiful and silent and compliant. Her voice had taken on a rhythmic quality, as if she were reciting a story she had told many times before, or perhaps never told at all. I was married at 16 to a man 3 times my age, a senator with more interest in his wine than his bride. I gave him 2 sons and a daughter before he died of a fever when I was 23. I thought I would be free then, but I was wrong. His brother wanted his estates, and the easiest way to get them was to eliminate the widow. He tried to kill you. He succeeded, Callista said, or he thought he did. He had me poisoned, and when that wasn't fast enough, he had me strangled. My body was thrown into the Bosphorus like garbage. But you survived. I did not survive. Her eyes met his with terrible intensity. I died, Darrell. I sank into the cold waters of the strait, and I died. And then something found me in the darkness. Something ancient and hungry and desperate for company. It gave me a choice, true death or this endless existence, this hunger that never abates, this watching of centuries pass like days. You feel it, she murmured, her lips still grazing his throat, and he felt the sharp edge of something there, teeth, fangs, the instruments of her nature, pressing against his skin without breaking it. The logos, the design. You studied it at CUNY, didn't you? The divine reason that orders the cosmos. Her tongue traced the line of his jugular, tasting the salt of his sweat, the copper of the blood pounding just beneath the surface. Do you think this is random, philosopher? Do you think a creature like me finds a man like you by accident? I don't believe in accidents, Darrow gasped. His hands gripped her hips through the leather, pulling her against him. I believe in telos, purpose, the arrow finding its target because the archer aimed true. Then what is our purpose? She asked. She pulled back just enough to meet his eyes. Her face was open now, vulnerable in a way that seemed foreign to features carved for predation. He saw the loneliness there, vast, oceanic, stretching back through centuries of solitary nights. He saw the hunger, not just for blood, but for understanding, for connection, for someone who could look upon her true nature and not flee. To burn, Darrell said. She laughed. The sound was silver bells falling down a deep well, beautiful and melancholy and endless. Come, she said. Let me show you the fire. Chapter 6. The Ascent. She took him from the club, leading him into the cooling night not with urgency, but with the inevitable pull of tide retreating from shore. The city roared around them, sirens, shouting punks, the subterranean rumble of the subway. But they moved within a bubble of silence, a vacuum created by the sheer density of her presence. They walked east, away from the pulsing neon of the club, and toward the black ribbon of the East River. The air changed, stripped of clove smoke and perfume, tasting instead of salt and rotting wood, and the deep cold currents of the Atlantic pushing against the city's edge. The streets grew darker, the buildings more industrial, the signs of life fewer and farther between. Callista walked beside him, her hand still clasped in his, her presence a constant pressure against his senses. She seemed different out here, away from the artificial darkness of the club, more real, perhaps, or more dangerous. In the club, she had been a creature of spectacle, a queen on her throne. Out here, in the true dark, she was something else entirely. Where are we going? Darrell asked. To the bridge, she said. I want to show you the city the way I see it. They reached the base of the Williamsburg Bridge, where the steel giant loomed over the water like the skeletal remains of some prehistoric leviathan. The bridge was an industrial cathedral, its towers rising into the fog like the spires of a church built by giants. The wind off the river was bitter, carrying the smell of salt and oil and the cold deep places of the Atlantic. She led him past the pedestrian walkway, down into the maintenance shadows where rats scurried with confident impunity, and the water lapped black and oily against the pylons. She stopped. She turned to him. In the gloom, her skin possessed its own luminescence, a faint pearlescent glow that owed nothing to streetlights or stars. What you're about to see, she said, will change everything. There's no going back after this. Do you understand? Darrell looked at her, this creature of myth and nightmare, this being who had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, who had lived through centuries that he could only read about in dusty books. He thought about his life before this night, the empty apartment, the abandoned dissertation, the endless circular thoughts that led nowhere. He thought about the walls he had built and the loneliness they had created. I understand, he said. Hold on, she whispered. And they rose. It was not flight as Darrell had imagined it, no flapping of wings, no superhero theatrics. It was a rejection of gravity, a silent and terrifying violation of every physical law he had ever studied. One moment his boots were grounded in the grime of the lower east side. The next the earth simply fell away. The sensation was sickening and sublime. He felt his stomach lurch into his throat, his equilibrium shattering as the horizon tilted and dropped. The wind screamed past him, tearing at his coat, stinging his eyes with cold. He clung to her, burying his face in the silk of her hair, breathing in ozone and ancient dust and the cold mineral scent of her skin. The city unfolded beneath them like a living map. He saw the grid of streets, the rivers of traffic, the million lights that made Manhattan a constellation fall into earth. He saw the dark slash of Central Park, the glitter of Times Square, the solemn towers of Wall Street standing like sentinels over the harbor. He saw it all from above, as gods must see it, as birds see it, as only those who have transcended the limitations of flesh can see it. They landed on the maintenance platform at the apex of the tower, 300 feet above the black water. The wind was ferocious here, a living thing that howled and clawed, but Callista stood amidst it like a statue carved from diamond, immovable, serene, ancient as the stone beneath their feet. She turned to him. The wind whipped her hair into a dark frenzy around her face. She looked wild now, elemental, the goddess of the night enthroned in her high temple above the sleeping city. This is my cathedral, she said. This is where I come when the weight of centuries grows too heavy to bear. From up here the city looks like a galaxy, all those tiny lights, each one a life, a story, a flame that burns for a moment and then goes out. I have watched millions of those flames flicker and die. I have watched the city itself transform from wilderness to village to the sprawling beast it is today. She moved to the edge of the platform, her toes at the very precipice, the void yawning beneath her. Darrell's heart seized with fear, though he knew rationally that she had nothing to fear from falling. I was born in Byzantium, she told him. Her voice carried over the wind without effort, resonating in his skull. I watched the Crusaders sack the city. I saw the Hagia Sophia's golden mosaic spattered with blood. I have watched empires fall and stars burn out. I have been alone for 1,000 years, Darrell. Alone in a way your human mind cannot comprehend. The loneliness of a god who has forgotten how to pray. She stepped closer. Her hands found the buttons of his shirt, undoing them one by one with fingers that moved like they had all the time in the world, because they did. She exposed his chest to the biting wind, to the freezing mist rising from the river. He did not shiver. The heat radiating from his body was a furnace, a biological fire burning against the entropy of the universe. She pressed her cold palms flat against his chest, over his heart, feeling the muscle and bone and rushing blood beneath. Her expression changed. Something softened behind those ancient eyes. Something cracked in the mask she had worn for centuries. Tell me about the loneliness, Darrell said. Tell me what it's like to live so long. She was silent for a long moment, her hands still pressed against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heart. When she spoke, her voice was distant, as if she were speaking from across a great divide. In the beginning, she said, there is rage. Rage at what was done to you. Rage at the creature who made you. Rage at God for allowing such abominations to exist. The rage sustains you for the first century or so. It gives you purpose, gives you fuel. Then comes the grief. You watch everyone you ever knew grow old and die. You watch your children age while you remain frozen in the form of a 23-year-old widow. You watch your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren, generation after generation, until the bloodline becomes so diluted that you can no longer recognize your own features in their faces. After grief comes detachment. You learn to stop caring, to view humanity as a spectacle rather than a community. You take what you need to survive and you move on. You change your name, your location, your appearance. You become a ghost, a legend, a rumor whispered in dark corners. And then finally comes the emptiness, the void at the center of your being that nothing can fill. You have read every book, seen every sight, tasted every pleasure and every pain. Nothing is new anymore. Nothing surprises you. You go through the motions of existence, but you are no longer truly alive. You are simply continuing. She looked up at him, and for the first time, he saw tears in her ancient eyes, thick and silver, like mercury, like something that had forgotten how to be water. I want you, she said. There was no seduction in her voice now, only raw truth. I don't want to drain you. I don't want to leave you a husk in an alleyway. I want to keep you. I want to bind you to me across whatever time remains. I want your mind, Darrell Varkov. I want your questions. I want your soul. My soul belongs to God, Darrell whispered. The words rose unbidden, the old catechism surfacing even as his hands found the laces of her corset. God made the night too, she hissed, pulling him down to the steel grating. God made the wolf and the lamb. God made the hunger. Do you think the Logos stops at sunset? Do you think the divine architect built a universe with corners? He could not see? She straddled him, the leather of her skirt riding up, her fishnets tearing against the metal. She loomed over him, blocking out the stars, the female form triumphant and terrible. She lowered herself, not to kiss his lips, but to kiss his throat. This is not death, she whispered against his pulse. This is the marriage. This is the sacrament. Hoc est enim corpus meum. Her fangs descended, ivory needles, perfect and sharp, glistening in the ambient city glow. Darrell tilted his head back, exposing the jugular, offering his life to her. Chapter 7. The Transformation. The pain was a flash of white light, a singularity of sensation that obliterated thought. It was followed instantly by pleasure so intense it bordered on agony, wave upon wave of it, crashing through him, dissolving the boundaries of his self. He felt the needlepoint entry. He felt the suction. He felt his life flowing out of him, a hot red tide leaving his body, and in its place, a cold electric current rushing in. It was a psychic invasion. As his blood hit her tongue, the barriers between their minds dissolved like sugar in rain. He felt her memories flooding his consciousness, not as pictures, but as lived experiences. He smelled the incense in the Hagia Sophia. He felt the heat of the burning library of Alexandria. He felt the crushing pressure of the deep ocean, where she had once slept for a century, waiting for the world to become interesting again. He felt her loneliness, a vast arid desert stretching back through a millennium. He felt her love, fierce, possessive, terrifying, a love that had been waiting for him since before his grandparents were born. He saw her life unfold like a tapestry woven from shadow and blood. He saw her as a young bride, frightened and hopeful. He saw her as a mother, cradling infants who would age and die while she remained unchanging. He saw her as a widow, betrayed and murdered and reborn into darkness. He saw her wandering through centuries, changing names and identities like costumes, watching history unfold from the shadows. He saw her in Constantinople, weeping as the Crusaders desecrated the city she had loved. He saw her in Venice, wearing the masks of carnival to hide her unchanging face. He saw her in Paris, watching the revolution devour its children. He saw her in London, stalking the fog-shrouded streets, while Jack the Ripper took the blame for deaths that were not entirely his doing. He saw her in New York, arriving on a ship in 1892, 100 years before this night, drawn by some instinct she did not understand to this city of immigrants and dreamers. And through it all, he felt her hunger, not just for blood, but for connection, for meaning, for someone who could see her truly and not be destroyed by the seeing. He was dying. The world faded to gray, the sounds of the city receding into a long tunnel. He was being born. The gray fractured into new colors, colors that had no names, ultraviolet and infrared, exploding behind his eyelids. She pulled back. Her mouth was smeared with his blood, a crimson mask of devotion. She looked at him with eyes that were no longer voids, but filled with terrible, tender recognition, the look of someone who had searched for 11 centuries, and finally found what she was seeking. I could stop here, she said, her voice trembling. I could let you go, let you die as a mortal, let your soul fly free to whatever awaits. You could still escape, Darrell. You could still choose the light. He looked up at her, his vision swimming, his heart struggling to beat with the blood that remained. He thought of everything he would be leaving behind, his life, his humanity, his place in the natural order. He thought of the sun he would never feel again, the food he would never taste, the simple pleasures of mortal existence. And then he thought of the loneliness he had carried his entire life, the emptiness that no philosophy had been able to fill. He thought of this woman who had lived for 1,000 years, and still searched for meaning, still yearned for connection, still believed that love was possible, even in the darkness. Finish it, he said. She raised her wrist to her mouth. She bit down, tearing the pale flesh. The ichor of the ancients welled up, dark and viscous, black as oil in the moonlight. Drink, she commanded. Drink and be whole. Drink and become the question. Darrell drank. It tasted of iron and eternity. It tasted of the Logos itself, the divine reason given liquid form. It tasted like the first breath after drowning. It hit his stomach like molten gold and raced through his veins, hunting down every weakness, every flaw, every mortal limit, burning them away. His cells reknit, his bones hardened. His synapses rewired themselves to fire at the speed of light. He gasped. His back arched off the steel grating. A cry tore from his throat, half human, half something else, a sound that had not been heard on this earth for a very long time. His heart gave one final thunderous beat, and stopped in silence, absolute, profound. The internal metronome that had measured his life for 25 years simply ceased, and he opened his eyes. Chapter 8, New Eyes. The world had been transformed. The night was no longer a veil of darkness, but a tapestry of living information. He could see the heat rising from ventilation shafts on Manhattan rooftops 3 miles distant, shimmering like specters in the infrared spectrum. He could see the structural stress in the bridge's steel cables, the metal singing with tension. His new eyes could read like text. He could hear the heartbeat of a pigeon nesting in the tower above them. Thump, 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 loud as a war drum. He could smell the ozone of the subway tracks beneath the river, the salt in the wind, the specific copper scent of the blood drying on his own lips. He sat up. His body moved with a fluid grace he had never possessed. The heaviness of his Queensborn frame transformed into something lighter, something filled with infinite potential energy. He looked at his hands. They were pale now, the veins dark and distinct beneath the skin. He flexed his fingers, marveling at the precision of the movement, the power coiled in every muscle fiber. He felt his teeth with his tongue and found them changed. His canines lengthened and sharpened into points that fit perfectly into grooves in his lower gums. He stood. The movement was effortless, as if gravity had become a suggestion rather than a law. He looked out over the city, and for the first time in his life, he truly saw it. Every light was a story. Every shadow was a possibility. The city that had always felt oppressive now felt like a garden of infinite wonder, waiting to be explored with senses that could pierce any darkness. He looked at Callista. She knelt beside him, but she did not look triumphant. She looked terrified. For the first time since he had seen her in the club, the ancient mask had fallen completely away. Her eyes were wide, searching his face with desperate anxiety. Her lower lip trembled, actually trembled, a gesture so human it seemed foreign on her immortal features. She touched his cheek with a shaking hand. "What have I done?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "I wanted to save you from mediocrity, Darrow. I wanted to give you eternity, but I fear I have only damned you to the dark. I have taken your son and given you only hunger." She looked away toward the sleeping city. "I have walked this earth for 1,100 years, telling myself I am a witness. But in the quiet hours before dawn I know what I am. I am a monster. And now, because I was selfish, because I was lonely, I've made you one too." Darrow felt the weight of her words, felt the centuries of self-loathing that had accumulated in her heart like sediment at the bottom of a dark well. He understood suddenly that this was the true gift he could give her, not his blood, not his body, but the absolution she had been seeking for 1,000 years. Darrell stood. He felt the steel grating beneath his boots, solid and real. He felt the wind, not as chill, but as texture. He felt the Logos humming in his transformed veins, the divine reason that ordered the universe, vibrating now at a new and darker frequency. He reached down, he took her hands. They were cold, but his were colder now. He pulled her up until they stood eye to eye, the philosopher and the ancient, the question and the answer, two creatures of the night facing each other above the sleeping world. "Look at me, Callista," he commanded. His voice was deeper now, resonating in his chest like a cello's lowest string. She looked at him. Her eyes were filled with centuries of guilt. "You haven't damned me," Darrell said. The realization struck him with the force of revelation. The pieces of a puzzle he had been assembling his entire life finally clicking into place. "You've just changed the vantage point. We drink blood to survive, Darrell. We are parasites. We exist outside the natural order." No, his voice was firm. The Aquinas he had studied, the theology he had wrestled with in the dusty stacks of the CUNY library, crystallized into perfect clarity. That is small thinking. That is human thinking. He turned her to face the skyline, the wounded colossus of Manhattan, the towers and spires and million lights of the city that never slept. "Think about the Logos," he said. "The word that was God and was God. The scripture says, 'For God so loved the world,' the cosmos. Not just the men, not just the day. The whole broken, beautiful, infinite machine." He squeezed her hands. His eyes burned with fierce intellectual fire. If the blood of Christ is truly infinite, if it is the blood of God, then it covers the sins of the whole world. It fills every crack in the universe. Do you think his grace stops at the grave? Do you think the creator of galaxies is afraid of the dark? Do you think his mercy is too weak to save a vampire? Callista stared at him. Her lips parted. For 1,000 years she had carried the weight of her nature as a curse, as proof of her damnation, as evidence that she had been cast out from grace forever. And now this philosopher from Queens, this man she had watched for weeks, this mind she had traced through darkness, was speaking the words she had never dared to hope for. "But we are predators," she whispered. "So is the lion," Darrell said. "So is the hawk. God made the night just as he made the day. He made the wolf just as he made the lamb. We are not outside his design. We are simply a part of it that humanity is too afraid to look upon. He stepped closer. He pressed his forehead against hers. His skin was cold now, matching hers, two creatures of the same temperature at last. We don't need to worry about what we are, he said, his voice dropping to a prayer. We only need to worry about how we live. We have faith, Callista. Faith that God is with us even here, 300 feet above the river. Faith that he will guide us. We won't be monsters. We will be guardians. We will be shepherds of the night, weeding out cruelty, protecting the lost, witnessing the history that the day walkers sleep through. Tears welled in Callista's eyes, thick and silver, like mercury, like something that had forgotten how to be water. They spilled down her pale cheeks, leaving gleaming trails. I have waited, she choked out. So long to hear that. I have waited 11 centuries for someone to tell me I am not a mistake. You are not a mistake, Darrell said. He kissed the tears from her cheeks. You are a miracle, and now so am I. Chapter 9. First dawn. The sky behind the Brooklyn skyline began to bruise with the first purple hint of dawn. The threat of the sun was real. Darrell could feel it in his new flesh, an instinctive recoiling from the light that was coming. But for the first time, it did not feel like judgment. It felt like a shift change. The day crew taking over from the night watch. We have to go, Callista said. But there was no fear in her voice now, only profound relief. A weight lifted that she had carried so long, she had forgotten what it felt like to stand upright. They descended from the tower, not by flight this time, but by climbing down the maintenance ladder, their enhanced bodies making the descent effortless. They moved through the pre-dawn streets, past the homeless who huddled in doorways, past the delivery trucks beginning their morning rounds, past the night shift workers heading home with exhausted eyes. Callista led him to a building on the Lower East Side, an old brownstone that had been converted into apartments at some point in the distant past. She produced a key from somewhere in the folds of her leather skirt and let them into a basement entrance that led to a heavy iron door. Beyond the door was a space that had been carved from the bedrock of Manhattan itself, a series of rooms that extended deep into the earth, far from any window, far from any hint of the deadly sun. The walls were stone, old stone, and covered with tapestries that Darrell recognized from his art history classes. Byzantine work, medieval European, artifacts that belonged in museums rather than in a basement apartment. Home, Callista said with a note of irony in her voice, such as it is. She led him through the main chamber, past furniture that spanned centuries, a Roman couch beside a Victorian settee, a medieval writing desk next to an Art Deco lamp. The effect should have been chaotic, but instead it felt curated, a personal history told through objects. They reached a bedroom carved from the stone, dominated by a massive four-poster bed draped in black velvet. Callista turned to face him, and in the candlelight of this underground sanctuary, she looked younger than he had ever seen her. Not young in years, but young in hope, young in the fragile, tentative way of someone who has just been told that maybe, just maybe, things might be okay. The first day is the hardest, she said. You'll feel the pull of the sun, even down here. You'll feel your body wanting to shut down, to die, to reject what it has become. You have to fight it. You have to hold on to the knowledge that the sun will set again, that the night will return, that you will wake. Darrell nodded. Already he could feel it, a heaviness in his limbs, a fog creeping into his thoughts, his new body demanding rest with an urgency that brooked no argument. Stay with me, he said. It was not a question. Always, she answered. From now until the stars burn out. They lay together on the velvet-draped bed, their cold bodies intertwined, finding comfort not in warmth but in presence, in the simple fact of not being alone. As the sun rose somewhere far above them, as the city began its diurnal stirring, as the world of the living went about its ignorant business, they slept, and in his sleep Darrell dreamed. He dreamed of libraries stretching into infinity, of questions that multiplied like fractals, of the logos made visible as a golden thread winding through the darkness. He dreamed of centuries to come, of the history he would witness, of the knowledge he would gather. He dreamed of Callista, of the life they would build together in the spaces between human awareness. And beneath all the other dreams, he dreamed of God. Not the God of his grandmother's church, the stern patriarch with his lists of sins and punishments. Not the God of his philosophy books, the abstract principle divorced from feeling. But the God of the night, the God of the margins, the God who loved the wolf as much as the lamb, and saw no contradiction in the design. He dreamed that he was not damned. He dreamed that he was chosen. He dreamed that even in the darkness, he was not alone. Chapter 10. The Covenant. Darrell woke to the sensation of Callista's eyes upon him. The underground chamber was lit by a single candle, its flame steady in the still air. Outside, somewhere far above them, the sun had set. He could feel it in his bones, a release of pressure, a flowering of strength. His body sang with renewed vitality, every sense sharpened, every muscle coiled with potential energy. How do you feel? Callista asked. She lay beside him, propped on one elbow, watching him with an expression that mixed concern with wonder. Darrell took stock of himself. The hunger was there, a gnawing emptiness in his core that demanded attention. But it was not the mindless, ravening thing he had feared. It was more like thirst, an intense thirst that colored his perceptions, that made him acutely aware of the blood that pulsed through every living thing. But that could be understood, could be managed, could be controlled. Hungry, he admitted, but not lost, not monstrous. Callista nodded slowly. That's the difference, she said, between those who embrace what they become and those who are destroyed by it. The ones who survive are the ones who can hold a hunger without being held by it. She rose from the bed with fluid grace and extended her hand to him. Come, I'll teach you to hunt. What followed was an education in a curriculum no university had ever offered. Callista led him through the underground tunnels that connected her lair to various points throughout the city, a network of passages that predated the subway, that had been carved by hands unknown for purposes best not examined too closely. They emerged in an alley behind a hospital in the meatpacking district, where blood was disposed of daily, where the weak and the dying gathered like moths around a flame of false hope. Callista showed him how to identify those who were beyond saving, the junkies in the final stages of overdose, the homeless whose bodies were finally surrendering to years of abuse, the terminal patients who had slipped out for one last taste of freedom before the end. We take only those who are already dying, she explained. We take only what we need. We are not murderers, Daryl. We are harvesters. We collect what would otherwise be wasted. It was a rationalization, Daryl knew, a way of making peace with the fundamental horror of their nature. But as he knelt beside an unconscious junkie in a doorway, as he felt the fading pulse beneath his lips, as he drank the tainted blood that tasted of chemicals and despair, he understood that rationalization was not the same as lie. They were taking what would have been lost regardless. They were using what the world had already discarded. The blood hit his system like electricity, like fire, like life itself, concentrated and delivered directly to his cells. The hunger retreated, satisfied for now, leaving behind a clarity of thought and sensation that bordered on the divine. When he looked up, Callista was watching him with an expression he could not read. You didn't lose yourself, she said. You didn't gorge, you didn't kill. Should I have? Most do. The first hunger is the hardest to control. The transformation awakens something primal, something that cares nothing for philosophy or restraint. But you held it. You held yourself. She moved to stand beside him, looking down at the junkie, who now slept peacefully, his vital signs actually stronger than they had been before. A side effect, she had explained, the saliva of their kind had healing properties, could close wounds, could restore what had been damaged. They were not just parasites. They were in some strange way also benefactors. I knew you were different, she said softly. From the first moment I saw you, walking past the club, your mind broadcasting questions like a radio tower, I knew you were the one I had been waiting for. The one, the partner, the companion. The other half of the equation I have been trying to solve for 1100 years. She turned to face him fully, and in the dim light of the alley, her face was open, vulnerable, young. I have a proposition, she said. A covenant, if you prefer the theological term. I'm listening. We have eternity before us. We have strength and senses beyond human comprehension. We have the ability to move through the world unseen, to influence events, to shape history from the shadows. The question is, what do we do with these gifts? Daryl thought about it. He thought about the philosophy he had studied, the questions of ethics and purpose and meaning. He thought about the empty life he had led before this night, the meaningless accumulation of knowledge that had led nowhere. He thought about what it might mean to have a purpose. Finally, after 25 years of searching, we use them, he said slowly, the idea taking shape as he spoke. We become what you said we could become, guardians, shepherds, witnesses. We protect those who cannot protect themselves. We punish those who prey on the innocent. We watch and we record and we remember what the daywalkers forget. Callista's eyes gleamed with something that might have been tears. And the faith, the logos you spoke of on the bridge, the faith remains, Daryl said. Perhaps grows stronger, in fact. Because if God can love creatures like us, if his grace can extend even to the darkest corners of creation, then his love is truly infinite. And a love that infinite is worth serving, worth honoring, worth dedicating eternity to. She took his hands. Her grip was strong, almost painful, but he did not pull away. Then we make a covenant, she said. Here in this alley, in the shadow of a hospital, where the dying come to be saved. We pledge ourselves to each other, and to the purpose we have chosen. We pledge to use our gifts for more than survival, for more than the mere continuation of existence. We pledge to be the instruments of a grace that neither of us fully understands, but both of us believe in. We pledge, Daryl agreed. And in that moment, something clicked into place, not just between them, but within him. The emptiness he had carried his entire life, the hollow space beneath his sternum that no amount of philosophy had been able to fill, was suddenly occupied. He was no longer alone. He was no longer purposeless. He was no longer the lost boy from Queens, wandering through a world that made no sense. He was something new, something ancient, something with a mission. The night stretched before them, full of shadows and secrets and the million stories of the city that never slept. They rose together and stepped out of the alley, two creatures of the night beginning a journey that would span centuries. Chapter 11. The morning after, they returned to Callista's underground sanctuary as the sky began to lighten, though Daryl no longer felt the desperate urgency of dawn that had gripped him the night before. His body was adjusting, learning to read the subtle signs of approaching day, giving him time to find shelter before the killing light arrived. In the main chamber, surrounded by the artifacts of 11 centuries, they sat together on the Roman couch and talked, not about their nature or their plans, but about everything else, about philosophy and history, about art and music, about the thousand small details of their lives that had led them to this moment. Callista spoke of Constantinople in its glory days, of the great library of Alexandria before its destruction, of the courts of medieval Europe where she had moved as a ghost, influencing events from the shadows. She spoke of the Renaissance, when she had sponsored artists and scholars, when she had been a patron of beauty in all its forms. She spoke of the Industrial Revolution, of the birth of photography, which had required her to become even more careful, even more hidden, of the world wars that had decimated humanity and made feeding almost too easy. And Darrell spoke of queens, of his grandmother's stories, of the books that had saved him, and the doubts that had nearly destroyed him. He spoke of the questions that had driven him. What is the nature of desire? What is the purpose of existence? What does it mean to be truly alive? And the answers that had always eluded him. You were asking the wrong questions, Callista said, when he had finished. Or rather, you were asking the right questions in the wrong frame. You were asking them as a human, expecting human answers. But you were never fully human, Darrell. I think you were always waiting for this, always holding yourself apart, always knowing that there was something more. And now I found it. Now you've found it. And me, and a purpose that might take eternity to fulfill. She leaned against him, her cold body molding to his, her head resting on his shoulder. For a long time they sat in silence, watching the candles flicker, listening to the distant rumble of the city above. There will be difficulties, she said eventually. There are others of our kind, and not all of them are as philosophical as we are. There are hunters too, humans who know what we are and seek to destroy us. There is the constant danger of exposure, of discovery, of the mob with torches that has chased our kind through every century. I know. And there's the hunger. It never goes away, Darrell. No matter how much you feed, no matter how much control you develop, the hunger is always there, waiting. Some nights it will be manageable. Other nights it will feel like a fire in your veins, consuming all reason, all restraint. You will be tempted to kill. You will want to kill. And on those nights you will need me to remind you of who you are, of what we have pledged, of the covenant we have made. And I will remind you, Darrell said. When the centuries weigh too heavily, when the loneliness threatens to consume you, when you forget that you are more than just a predator, we will remind each other. She lifted her head and looked at him, and in her ancient eyes he saw something he had never expected to see, hope. I love you, she said. The words seemed to surprise her as much as they surprised him, as if she had not intended to say them, as if they had escaped from some locked chamber in her heart that had been sealed for centuries. Darrell touched her face, tracing the sharp line of her cheekbone, the curve of her lips. I love you too, he said. I think I have always loved you in some way. I think I was born loving you, and everything else was just waiting. She kissed him then, and the kiss was unlike anything he had ever experienced. Cold lips pressed to cold lips, two beings of the same nature finding each other across the void. There was no warmth in it, but there was heat of a different kind, a passion that transcended temperature, that existed in the spaces between atoms. When they finally parted, the candles had burned low, and somewhere far above them, the sun was beginning its deadly transit across the sky. Let it come, Darrell said, though he pulled her toward the bedroom. We have tomorrow night, and the night after that, and a million nights after that. We have eternity to figure out the rest. He stopped her at the doorway. He looked at this woman, this creature of myth and history, this ancient being who had searched through time to find him. He realized she had not been looking for a lover. She had been looking for a priest. She had been searching for someone to absolve her. He cupped her face in his hands. Her skin was smooth and cold and perfect. Her eyes held wonder now instead of despair. Honey, he whispered, the queen's accent softening the weight of the moment. I love this song. May I have this dance? Callista laughed. The sound rang out through the underground chambers like a church bell, pure, unburdened, joyful. A sound she had not made in centuries. A sound she had forgotten she was capable of making. Of course, she said. I'll let you lead this time. Thank you, my love. Epilogue. 1 year later. The night was cold, the air crisp with the promise of winter. Darrell stood on the observation deck of the Empire State Building, looking out over the city that had become his hunting ground, his parish, his home. A year had passed since his transformation, and in that year he had learned more than he had learned in 25 years of mortal life. He had learned the rhythms of the night, the secret geography of darkness that overlaid the city's bright surfaces. He had learned to hunt with precision and mercy, taking only what was needed, leaving his victims alive and somehow healthier than before. He had learned the history that textbooks never taught, the hidden currents of power that shaped events from the shadows. And he had learned love. Callista appeared beside him, materializing from the darkness, as if she were made of it. She wore a long black coat that billowed in the wind, her hair streaming behind her like a banner of night. She slipped her hand into his, her cold fingers interlacing with his cold fingers, a gesture as natural now as breathing had once been. The others are asking about you, she said. Let them ask. They want to meet you, to assess you, to determine whether you are a threat or an ally. Darrell smiled. In the past year, he had learned about the others, the scattered community of their kind that existed in every major city, connected by bonds of blood and territory and ancient rivalry. He had learned about the politics, the power struggles, the eternal jockeying for position that occupied creatures who had no other way to measure their existence. What do you think? He asked. I think they have never met anyone like you. I think you frighten them. A philosopher vampire. I suppose that is rather unusual. It's not the philosophy that frightens them. It's the faith. Darrell nodded slowly. In the years since his transformation, he had not abandoned his theological questions. He had deepened them. He had read the works of the Church Fathers with new eyes, had explored the mystical traditions of East and West, had wrestled with the question of what it meant to be a creature of darkness who still believed in the light, and he had come to a conclusion that would have seemed paradoxical to his mortal self. Faith was not diminished by darkness, but refined by it. Like gold tested by fire, belief could survive the reality of vampirism, was stronger than belief that had never been challenged. Let them be frightened, he said. Perhaps a little fear will do them good. Callista laughed, and the sound still surprised him with its purity, its joy. In the years since they had pledged themselves to each other, she had changed too, slowly, tentatively, like a flower uncurling after a long winter. The ancient mask she had worn for 11 centuries was cracking, revealing the woman beneath, the woman who had been frozen on the night of her death, and was finally beginning to thaw. What are you thinking? She asked. I'm thinking about the future, about the centuries that lie ahead, about all the things we might accomplish, all the good we might do, all the questions we might answer. And I'm thinking about how strange it is to be happy. She squeezed his hand. Is that what this is? I had forgotten the word. I think so. It feels like completion, like finding the missing piece of a puzzle I didn't know I was solving. Below them, the city throbbed with its endless energy, lights and noise, and 8 million lives burning like candles in the dark. Each of those lives was a story, tragedy, a comedy, a mystery waiting to be explored, and they had eternity to explore them. We should go, Callista said. The night is young, and we have promises to keep. Darrell nodded. They stepped back from the railing, moved toward the shadows that would take them down and out into the waiting city. But before they left, he paused. He turned to face the east, where the sun would eventually rise, and he offered a prayer that would have shocked his grandmother and confused his professors. He prayed for guidance. He prayed for wisdom. He prayed for the strength to honor the covenant he had made, to use his dark gifts for light purposes, to be worthy of the love that had found him in the most unlikely of places. And somewhere in the space between stars, in the silence between heartbeats, he felt an answer, not in words, not in visions, just a sense of presence, of attention, of a vast and incomprehensible love that embraced all of creation, the day and the night, the living and the dead, the damned and the saved. God was in the night, and they were his children too. They descended into the shadows, hand in hand. They were not damned. They were not lost. They were simply walking a different path up the same mountain, guided by the same stars, covered by the same infinite grace. The city woke below them, oblivious to the miracle that had occurred in the dark. But Darrell Varkov, son of Queens, knew, and Callista of Bazan knew. As they vanished into the darkness of the lower east side, a profound peace settled over their still hearts. The night waited for them, full of shadows and secrets, and the promise of forever. And together they stepped into it,